everyone, and welcome back to
CrimePod Chronicles. I'm Mike.
And I'm Tori. And today we're delving into a case that, honestly, it shocked so many people, right? The entire nation, really.
Absolutely, Tori. We're talking about the horrific 2022 University of Idaho killings. It's a tragedy that, it sent ripples of fear and sorrow through not just the university community, but really the whole country.
Yeah, it really did. And we're going to try our best to break down the details, the timeline, all of it, just to help, shed some light on what happened and the journey to finding answers.
So let's just jump right into the basics of what happened. This all took place on November 13th, 2022 in Moscow, Idaho. The address specifically was 1122 King Road.
Yeah, and it involved 4 University of Idaho students, which is just heartbreaking. We're talking about Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. They were all found tragically stabbed to death.
Yeah, just absolutely brutal. I mean, multiple stabbings with a large fixed blade knife. And what makes it, even more chilling, if that's possible, is that there were actually 2 other roommates in the house at the time.
Right, and they were completely unharmed. They survived, which is just, I can't even imagine the trauma of being in that house when all of that went down and, coming out of it uninjured but having to live with that knowledge. It's just really haunting.
Absolutely, Tori, it really is. And I think to fully grasp the horror of this, we need to really walk through the timeline because it's so precise in some ways, but also just so terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, the evening of November 12th really kicks it off, right? Leading into the early morning of November 13th. So if we look at Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin, they had been at a party at the Sigma Chi fraternity, and they got back to the house around 1:45 a.m.
Right, and then just shortly after them, you have Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves. They had been out at a bar, the Corner Club, and then, they grabbed some food from a food truck. They returned home around 1:56 a.m. So everyone's back in the house, just before 2 a.m.
And then, this is where it really starts to get chilling because around 4 a.m., a DoorDash order was actually delivered to the house. So someone was still up, receiving that.
Yeah, that detail, Tori, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Who got the food? Were they okay at that moment? Because the window for the murder story is incredibly tight. It's estimated to have occurred between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m.
That's what gets me, that 25-minute window. And then there's the surviving roommate's account, which is just haunting. She heard strange noises. I mean, can you imagine? And then she actually saw a masked man around 4:17 a.m.
Yeah, she saw him, and she just immediately locked herself in her room. And, you can't blame her. It's just a natural human response to that kind of terror. But the fact that she was there, she saw something, it's a crucial detail for investigators. But for her, it's just pure trauma.
Absolutely. And then it's not until much, much later in the morning, around 11:58 a.m., that a 911 call was made. And it reported an unconscious person, which, suggests they didn't even realize the full scope of what had happened initially. They just knew something was terribly wrong.
Yeah, I mean, the official report states unconscious person, but obviously, as we know, it was so much more devastating than that. It just, it underscores how long it took for the full tragedy to even be discovered.
Yeah, and I think that, when they finally did get there, the scene that they walked into, it was just beyond comprehension. I mean, the details that came out about the crime scene itself are just so grim.
They really are, Tori. I mean, the victims were found, spread across the house. Specifically, they were found in beds on both the second and third floors. So it wasn't contained to just one area. Right. And what's interesting, or I guess chilling, is that there were no signs of sexual assault, no signs of restraint, or even forced entry into the house, which, it just adds to the mystery initially of how this even happened. How did someone get in?
Exactly. It's unsettling, isn't it? The lack of forced entry It implies a level of access or stealth that's just terrifying. And then, of course, the reports mention blood-spattered walls.
Yeah, I remember reading that, just thinking, like, the sheer violence. It really drives home the brutality of what occurred there. And I mean, another detail that just stood out to me was how some of the victims were found.
Yeah, that's probably one of the most heartbreaking details, honestly. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen, they were found in the same bed.
Yeah, they were best friends. And then Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin, they were also found in her bed. It speaks to that intimacy of friendship, that kind of bond, even in their final moments. It's just so devastating to think about.
It really is. It paints such a tragic picture, doesn't it? It just adds this layer of vulnerability, being in their own beds, asleep. It just makes the whole thing even more horrific.
Yeah, absolutely. It's beyond comprehension, really. And I think, when the initial shock wore off, the focus immediately shifted to, okay, how do we even begin to piece this together? And that's where, like, the massive law enforcement effort came into play.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it wasn't just like a few local officers. We're talking about a huge, massive undertaking. Over 130 personnel, if I recall correctly, from different agencies, local, state, and the FBI, all converged on Moscow, Idaho, just trying to make sense of, well, what happened?
Right, and it had to be like an absolute all-hands-on-deck situation, given the brutality and the lack of initial clues, And I think one of the first really critical pieces of evidence that emerged, which was just mind-boggling, was this knife sheath.
The knife sheath, yes, that was huge. I mean, finding it on Madison Mogen's bed, and it wasn't just any knife sheath, right? It had DNA evidence on it, male DNA specifically. That was like the first major breakthrough, I think, that really gave them a lead to go on.
It absolutely was. It was like a tangible piece, And then beyond that, another really crucial element that came to light was this mysterious vehicle, a white Hyundai Elantra that was caught on surveillance near the crime scene. And it was seen at like really key times, which is just super suspicious.
Super suspicious is an understatement, Mike. I mean, it's not like it was just driving by. It was there, like lurking almost, near the house precisely during that critical window. And that car, that white Elantra, became like a massive part of the investigation for a long time.
Yeah, it became iconic almost in the news coverage. Everyone was looking for a white Hyundai Elantra. And then, building on that, there was also cell phone data that played a huge role. They found that the suspect's device, whoever it was actually inactive during the murders and then reconnected later, which, suggests they knew what they were doing and were trying to evade detection.
It really does. It paints a picture of, a calculated move, doesn't it? Like they purposefully turned it off or whatever they did to avoid being tracked. And then once they were clear, they switched it back on. It just shows, a level of forethought that's just chilling.
And, speaking of chilling forethought, all of these pieces of evidence, the DNA, the car, the cell phone data, they eventually led to a name, right? To a specific person.
Yeah, they absolutely did, Mike. And that's when Bryan Kohberger emerged as the prime suspect. I mean, it was a massive moment when the news broke.
Oh, for sure. I remember exactly where I was when I heard about his arrest. It was in December 2022, right? And it wasn't even local to Idaho. He was arrested by FBI SWAT in Pennsylvania. That just adds like another layer of, almost surrealness to it.
Yeah, Pennsylvania, miles away from Moscow, Idaho. And the details surrounding that arrest were just pretty intense, like a full FBI SWAT operation. But what really, I think, made everyone just stop and think, what was his background?
Right, his background. He was a 28-year-old Ph.D. student in criminology at Washington State University, which is just like
unbelievably unsettling.
Unsettling is the word. A criminology student, someone who, studies crime and criminal behavior, allegedly committing such a heinous, brutal act, it complicates the entire narrative, doesn't it? It's not just a random person. It's someone who theoretically should understand the consequences, the process, everything.
Exactly. It almost feels like a bad movie plot, but it's real life. And that fact alone, his background, I think just added so much more like public fascination, but also, a deeper sense of betrayal or something. It's hard to reconcile.
Yeah, it truly is. And that's what made the evidence against him so crucial, because it started to really piece together this really disturbing puzzle. I mean, where do we even begin with the evidence story?
Well, I think the most compelling piece right off the bat has to be the DNA. Remember, we talked about that knife sheath found on Madison Mogen's bed?
Oh, yeah, the one that had the male DNA. That was like the first big break, wasn't it?
Exactly. So that DNA, they were able to connect it to Bryan Kohberger. And the way they did it, it's pretty wild, actually. They used genetic genealogy, which is just fascinating. But then they really solidified it by collecting his DNA from trash at his parents' home. It's a huge step in an investigation.
Wow. So they got a preliminary hit with the genealogy, and then they confirmed it with a discarded item. That's incredibly strategic, actually. It's they're not just guessing, they're building a really solid foundation.
Right, exactly. And then, if the DNA wasn't enough, we had the whole saga of that white Hyundai Elantra. We talked about how that was seen on surveillance near the crime scene at key times.
The elusive Elantra. So many people were talking about that car in the early days of the investigation. So Kohberger's vehicle, it matched that?
It absolutely did. His car was identified as the very same Elantra seen in surveillance footage near 1122 King Road. And that really, put him at the scene, not just hypothetically, but with hard evidence. It's hard to dispute that.
Yeah, I mean, a specific car, a specific time, that's not just a coincidence. And then, as if that wasn't enough, there was also his cell phone data, right? That's always a big one in these kinds of cases.
Oh, absolutely. The cell phone data, Tori, it was pretty damning. It showed his phone was inactive, completely turned off or in airplane mode during the critical window when the murders occurred. And then it reconnected later, and guess where it reconnected? Near the crime scene.
Ugh, that's just chilling. So he allegedly turns it off to go commit the crime and then turns it back on right after, still in the vicinity? That just screams premeditation, doesn't it? Like trying to avoid being tracked?
It really does. It suggests a clear attempt to evade detection, but obviously it didn't work. The sequence of events from the DNA to the vehicle matching to the very specific cell phone pings, it all just, created this very tight narrative connecting him to the brutal killings. It's really hard to argue with those combined pieces of evidence.
No, it's almost overwhelming when you list it all out like that. It wasn't just one thing. It was a methodical accumulation of forensic evidence, vehicle sightings, and then this really telling cell phone data. It really painted a picture for the prosecution, I imagine.
It absolutely did, and it really allowed them to build a strong case leading up to, the legal proceedings that would follow. Yeah, and that leads us right into, what happens next, right? All this evidence has been gathered. He's arrested. So then what are the actual legal charges against Bryan Kohberger?
Well, it's pretty straightforward, Tori. He's facing 4 counts of first-degree murder, one for each of the victims. And then there's also an additional charge of felony burglary, so it's pretty severe.
Felony burglary, too. Right, because he entered the home without permission, obviously, with the intent to commit a felony, which in this case was murder.
Exactly. And when he first appeared in court, it was interesting because he actually stood silent. He didn't enter a plea himself.
Oh, that's right. I remember reading about that. So if a defendant stands silent, what happens then? Does the court just assume something?
Yeah, pretty much. When a defendant stands silent, the judge or the court enters a not guilty plea on their behalf. So even though he didn't say the words, a not guilty plea was officially entered for him. It's a procedural thing.
Huh. Interesting. So it's they're not admitting guilt, but they're not explicitly denying it in that moment, but still the legal process moves forward with him pleading not guilty.
Right, exactly. And the prosecution, they're not holding back either. They've made it very clear that they're seeking the death penalty in this case.
Wow, the death penalty. That's huge. That just shows like the gravity of what they believe happened here and the evidence, obviously, that they've amassed.
Absolutely. And speaking of the trial, there have been some developments regarding that. It was actually moved from Moscow, Idaho to Boise.
Oh, why was that? Was it like too much local attention? Because I imagine the entire community of Moscow was just reeling from this.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It was moved due to concerns about impartiality. The thinking was that with such a high-profile case and the sheer emotional impact they had on such a small community like Moscow, it would be extremely difficult to find an unbiased jury. So moving it to Boise, a larger city, was seen as a way to potentially get a more impartial jury pool.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It's almost impossible to live in Moscow and not have been deeply affected or have strong opinions about this case. So moving it's for the sake of, a fair trial. What are the current timelines for jury selection and the trial itself?
Well, jury selection is actually set to begin on July 30, 2025. And then the trial itself, the actual start date, is currently slated for August 11, 2025. So it's still, a little ways off, but the process is definitely moving forward.
So over a month from now, that gives everyone time to prepare, I guess, for what will be a very intense and emotional trial. It's a long road to justice, isn't it?
It really is. And I think that brings us to the aftermath of all of this, how the community, how the university has tried to cope and to heal from such a profound tragedy.
Yeah, it's just unimaginable what they've been through.
I know one of the very significant things that happened was the demolition of the house itself, that murder house on King Road.
Right. Yeah, the house where it all happened, it was actually donated to the University of Idaho, and then they made the decision to demolish it in December of 2023, which I think makes a lot of sense just to, remove that physical reminder of such a horrific event.
Absolutely. I can't imagine walking by that house every day or just having it stand there. It's a very symbolic act to remove it. But they've also done other things on campus to memorialize the victims, haven't they?
Yeah, they definitely have. In fact, a healing garden was created on campus, which is just, a really beautiful way to honor the victims and provide a space for reflection and remembrance for the students and the wider community. And also, quite significantly, posthumous degrees and scholarships were awarded in the victims' names.
Oh, that's really touching. I mean, they were so close to achieving those degrees, and to have that recognition and for scholarships to be established in their names, it just ensures their legacy continues in such a positive way, beyond this horrific event.
Yeah, it really does. It's a way to transform something so awful into a way to help future students and just keep their memories alive, which is so important.
For sure. Now, speaking of the wider community, this case, as we know, it gained massive national attention. And that often, it always comes with a lot of public response, especially on social media. And I remember seeing so much speculation and theories, flying around.
Oh, absolutely. The social media aspect of this case was intense, to say the least. It really fueled massive speculation and honestly a lot of misinformation, which, from an investigative standpoint, that can really complicate things for law enforcement. It just creates noise, basically.
Yeah, it's got to be incredibly frustrating for investigators when you have all these amateur detectives out there, putting out theories, some of which are just completely unfounded, and it can actually potentially hinder real progress.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's human nature to want to understand and to try and yeah, it's been a long, difficult road for everyone involved. And, we really hope the legal proceedings bring the answers and the justice that these families deserve.
For sure. And with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of CrimePod Chronicles. We really appreciate you tuning in and sticking with us through this very, very heavy but important case.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, you can find us on social media. Look for CrimePod Chronicles and let us know what you thought about this episode or if there's any cases you'd like us to cover.
Absolutely. We'll love hearing from you guys, and make sure to join us next time because we're going to be delving into another fascinating, albeit, dark, cold case, this time from a little closer to home, actually, in my neck of the woods.
Ooh, intrigued. Can't wait for that one. So, from Tori and myself, Mike, thank you again for joining us on CrimePod Chronicles. We'll see you next time.